Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Great to have you with us again. We're doing what we always do, taking a whole load of sources, articles, research papers, notes, and pulling out the really key stuff so you get the picture fast. Today, our focus is on something pretty central to Israeli military capability, the F-15 jet. Specifically within the Israeli Air Force, the IAF, we've got materials looking at their history, what's been happening recently, and the sort of strategic side of things, especially when it comes to flying long distances.
Yeah, and our job here is basically to sift through all this and get to the core insights. We want to help you understand why these particular planes are so crucial for Israel's strategy, what
Yeah.
they can actually do, and, how that fits into the bigger picture in the region.
Exactly, because these aren't just planes, are they? As the sources make clear, they're absolutely fundamental to how Israel projects power. So let's get into it.
Okay, so first off, the F-15 Eagle. It's been like a cornerstone for the IAF for decades, really the backbone.
Right. And the sources immediately flag that it's not just one kind of F-15 we're talking about. They've used different versions over the years. Can you maybe walk us through the main ones that pop up in our material?
Sure. The discussion really boils down to two main types that have shaped the fleet. First, you've got the older generation, which the IAF calls the BAS.
The BAS.
Yeah.
Those are the F-15A, C, and D models, yeah. What do the sources tell us about their history, their role?
That's right. And their history is, well, long and pretty significant. The sources trace them back to the First Lebanon War. They were involved in some really famous operations like Opera, that big strike, and critically, Operation Wooden Leg back in 1985.
Ah, Wooden Leg, targeting the PLO HQ near Tunis, right? I remember the sources making a point about that being the IAF's first really long-range strike.
Yeah.
That must have been pushing the limits back then.
Oh, absolutely. It showed a capability that was, frankly, pretty rare at the time. These older BAS planes, they're based at Tel Nov Air Base. They've been upgraded over the years, flown both air-to-air and ground attack missions. But the sources are pretty direct. They say they're considered very long in the tooth now.
Getting a bit old. Which naturally brings us to their replacement, or successor rather, the current workhorse, the ROM.
The ROM, yeah, that's a whole different level. It's the F-15I. It's actually a special version of the American F-15E Strike Eagle, designed specifically for Israel. It came into service around January 1998, and it's really presented in the sources as the IAF's lead plane, their top multirole combat jet.
And the material really hammers home why it's got that status. What are the key things about the ROM that make it so vital?
Well, its dual rollability is huge. It's just as good at deep strike missions as it is at air-to-air interception. But the things the sources really emphasize again and again are its incredible range and its payload capacity. We're talking about carrying up to 11 tons of weapons.
11 tons. That is a massive amount of ordnance for one plane.
It really is. And you combine that with its advanced systems. It's basically designed for hitting targets deep inside enemy territory, at long range, flying low, day or night, doesn't matter the weather. The sources even mention the specific engines too, Pratt & Whitney F100 PW229s. Powerful engines.
And that power obviously translates into performance. The older BAs could hit Mach 2.5, which is fast, but the Raman is noted for its speed down low, over 1,000 kilometers per hour, and its ferry range is almost 4,500 kilometers.
That kind of range is serious. It means it can reach targets way out there, across a huge chunk of the Middle East, potentially even further.
And the operational examples cited seem to back that up. The sources mentioned the RAM leading that first strike in Yemen back in July. And it was apparently the RANAM they used for the mission to eliminate Nasrallah in Beirut. Chose it specifically, it seems, for that mix of speed, low-altitude flight, and range.
Right. But it's interesting, even the older BAS planes are still getting used effectively, according to some reports. One piece mentioned BAS jets hitting Houthi targets at the port of Hodeidah and apparently managing to avoid being detected.
So it seems like both types have really proven themselves in tough situations, conducting intense strikes deep in hostile territory, during major operations, including the current conflict.
Yeah, what this whole history and the capabilities really show you when you put it together is how the IAF deliberately built up its long-range strike power. It wasn't an accident. It was developed, refined over decades, really centered on these F-15 variants. That evolution comes through clearly in the material.
And that evolution, that constant updating, leads us right into a really major recent development that the sources cover, one that shows just how committed Israel remains to this long-range capability.
You mean the news about the new F-15 purchase? The big one.
Exactly that. The sources lay out Israel's decision, buying 25 brand new F-15IA Advanced Eagles. And there's an option for 25 more after that.
And this isn't just talk. The contract was apparently signed just yesterday, November 6th, 2024, with Boeing. The first batch of 25 costs $5.2 billion, delivery starting in 2031.
Yeah, the sources call it a significant milestone, and you can see why. It's the first time in nearly 30 years Israel's bought new Eagles.
And this F-15IA, it's based on the U.S. Air Force's latest, the F-15EX, but tailored for Israel. What gets praised most in the material is, again, exceptional range and stores carrying capacity. Those are clearly the features Israel is doubling down on for those long-range strikes with heavy weapons.
What kind of specific weapons or payload improvements are we talking about with this IA model?
Well, standard stuff, obviously, A-120 AMRAAM missiles, the Vulcan cannon, but the real buzz seems to be about its potential for carrying outsized weapons. Things like hypersonic missiles are mentioned, or maybe just carrying a lot more of the heavy bombs they already use.
So it's not just about reaching further, but hitting harder or hitting more things when it gets there. How does this fit into the bigger picture for the IAF, according to the sources?
It's seen as working alongside the F-35's stealth fighters. They complement each other. The F-15IA brings the range, the massive payload, the sheer volume of firepower that the F-35, which is more about stealthy penetration, might not offer in the same way. They're described as forming a combined spearhead.
Okay. So this purchase could potentially double the number of F-15s they have that are really optimized for strike missions. Do the sources guess what happens to the older planes? The BAS.
There's some speculation. Maybe the new IAs replace the aging BAS squadrons entirely, or maybe they fly alongside the existing RAMs, assuming those get upgraded too. But it's not happening in a vacuum. The sources tie this into a much bigger spending push since October 7th, 2023, something like nearly $40 billion in deals, also including more F-35s and Apache helicopters.
Right. So for you listening, what this really shows is a military making very deliberate, very expensive, long-term bets on specific capabilities. Long-range, heavy payload. It's a direct response to what they see as the strategic needs and the threats in their neighborhood. It connects that whole history of the F-15 right into their future plans.
And that laser focus on long-range capability, well, it naturally leads us to the third big theme in our source material, which is the wider strategic angle. What does having this kind of power actually mean, especially when you start thinking about potential future challenges, like the situation with Iran?
Yeah, this is where the analysis in the documents gets really detailed and frankly quite sobering. Looking at the immense complexities and the factors involved if you were ever to use this kind of capability against really difficult targets.
Okay.
And we need to be super clear here. This is the assessment presented in the source material we reviewed. We're just relaying that analysis.
Absolutely crucial point. The sources, one AWS piece in particular, lay out just how tough targeting something like Iran's nuclear program would be. What sort of difficulties do they highlight?
Well, first off, the facilities themselves. They're described as incredibly challenging targets. They're spread out all over the country. They're big. They're always being built or modified. And critically, many are underground or heavily hardened, buried deep.
And then there's the problem of knowing where everything is. The material mentions the possibility of unknown sites or maybe Iran moving things around, like a shell game. Plus, the really difficult issue of some sites potentially being close to civilian areas or having dual civilian military uses. That raises huge concerns about potential collateral damage.
Definitely. And the sources also detail Iran's efforts to physically protect these places, digging deep underground halls, tunnels, using massive concrete shields, camouflage, potentially even getting help from North Korea on tunneling and hardening. These are not easy targets.
Okay, so given that challenge, how does the analysis in our sources rate Israel's current strike options, like their F-15s, against that kind of target set?
Well, the suggestion is that Israel would likely need to use its best jets, the F-15I Rams, maybe supported by X-16s that have been specially kitted out for range, perhaps using those conformal fuel tanks you sometimes see.
Right, the ones that hug the fuselage. And it wouldn't just be the planes doing the hitting, would it? The sources stress the need for a whole support package.
A big one. They talk about needing a relatively large number of support aircraft. Escort fighters, electronic warfare planes to jam radars, aerial refueling tankers, even search and rescue aircraft just in case.
Which raises a major constraint the sources discuss. Just how long could you keep such a complex operation going? The analysis seems to lean towards it being potentially a one-time surprise operation. not something easily repeatable or sustainable over days or weeks.
And intelligence is flagged as another huge hurdle.
Hmm.
Even with good satellites, the sources question whether it's possible to get the kind of specific, actionable intelligence needed to find and be sure you've destroyed all the critical parts of the dispersed program.
What about the weapons themselves? The sources mention things like the GBU-28 bunker buster bomb. Israel bought 500 of those back in 2005, apparently.
They do mention it. But the analysis also casts some serious doubt on whether even those bombs could reliably destroy targets buried really, really deep underground.
And then there are the logistical headaches. Refueling is apparently a big one. The sources describe Israeli tankers as relatively slow and very vulnerable. They'd need their own escorts. And just generally concerns about whether all these support aircraft could even survive operating deep inside Iranian airspace for any length of time.
Maybe the biggest obstacle discussed, though, is the sheer geopolitical messiness. The flight paths. Any strike would almost certainly need to fly over other countries, Jordan, Iraq, maybe Saudi Arabia or other Gulf states. The sources emphasize the massive political risks involved for any country granting that permission, especially if it wasn't just a one-off.
Yeah, huge political sensitivities there. The sources also spend time analyzing how Iran might react, what its options for retaliation would be. Again, this is purely the analysis from the material. First, they look at Iran's defenses, generally assessed as having quantity but not much quality. Lots of older systems, not well integrated, probably vulnerable to modern electronic countermeasures.
And Iran's own air force is seen as likely struggling in any direct air-to-air fights. But then the analysis shifts to how Iran could hit back after being struck.
And the potential responses laid out in the sources are pretty broad and worrying. They talk about Iran launching its Shahab-3 missiles, possibly, and this is a chilling thought from the analysis, possibly with chemical, biological, or radiological warheads aimed at Israeli cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, military bases, maybe even Israel's own suspected nuclear sites.
The sources also game out escalation, using proxy forces, Hezbollah, Hamas, maybe suicide bombings, covert CBR attacks smuggled in, or just massive missile barrages from Lebanon or Gaza. And it goes wider. The threat of covert attacks on Israeli or Jewish interests anywhere in the world.
And the analysis doesn't stop there. It includes possible retaliation against U.S. forces or interests in the region, say in Iraq or Afghanistan, or hitting softer targets, maybe even U.S. naval forces. Plus, the economic weapon, disrupting oil shipping through the Strait of Hormuz or just cutting exports to spike global oil prices.
Wow. Okay, so what this whole section of analysis from the sources really drives home, just the incredible complexity and the almost terrifyingly high stakes involved in any potential use of this long-range strike capability in that kind of scenario. It makes it crystal clear that it's about so much more than just having capable planes like the F-15. It's about the technical hurdles, the intelligence gaps, the logistics, and these massive geopolitical risks with potentially devastating, wide-ranging consequences.
It really does. It highlights that these powerful F-15s, while crucial, are just one component in an unbelievably complicated strategic equation. The challenges, the potential repercussions outlined in these sources, they're really quite profound.
Okay, let's try and wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. We started with the F-15's deep roots in the IAF, looking at the older BAZ variants and the workhorse Ram. We saw how these planes were absolutely central to building Israel's long-range strike power over many decades.
Then we looked at how that legacy is being actively pushed forward with that major purchase of the new advanced F-15IA Eagles, a clear signal of Israel's ongoing strategic focus on range and heavy payload.
And finally, we explored the really complex strategic world these capabilities exist in. We looked at the analysis drawn straight from our source material about the immense challenges, technical, logistical, political, and the potentially severe consequences of actually using that power against distant, hardened targets.
Yeah, we tried to take quite a dense pile of information there and pull out the really essential threads for you, hopefully giving you a clear understanding of both a critical piece of military technology and the really significant strategic context it fits into.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over. As air forces around the world, not just Israel's, invest more and more in platforms like the F-15IA, platforms explicitly designed for long-range power projection, how does that growing ability to reach out and touch targets far, far away fundamentally change the way nations think about conflict, about deterrence, about stability in their regions?
Especially as we discussed, when faced with the kind of incredibly difficult challenges, those dispersed, hardened targets, the intelligence limitations, and the very real threat of major retaliation that the source analysis highlighted in the context of Iran. It's a heavy question and definitely something to consider after this deep dive.